We've already talked about stops when we talked about shutter speed, aperture and ISO, but I'd like to just concentrate on the concept of stops because they behave in an exponential way, which is quite important for the way we understand the way it all works. So stop is a term we use in photography when referring to the control of light. ISO, shutter speed and aperture all relate to stops that control the exposure of the image. A one-stop change either doubles or halves the amount of light hitting the sensor. The stop scale is an exponential scale. Now this is really important to try and get your head around. So we can see the effect of the exponential scale using this illustration, and we can only cover about 5 stops here because of the scale of the drawing. So if you imagine 1 stop, 2 stop is double the amount of light as 1 stop. 3 stops is quadruple the amount of light as 1 stop. 4 stop is 8 times the amount of light. 5 stops is 16 times the amount of light from the first stop. And of course we continue on 6 stops, 7 stops. So you get the idea, it's an exponential increasing amount of light or decreasing amount of light. So a typical sunny scene illustrated could have a brightness range of 10 stops or more, from the very darkest areas through to the very brightest areas. Now that isn't just 10 times as much, that is a 1,000 times great difference between the dark and the bright tones. So this slide illustrates the range of brightnesses from virtually pitch black to what it would be like if we were actually stood on the surface of the sun, which would be quite bright. Okay, from dark through to bright. We can divide this up into brightness levels, which we call stops, and because of this exponential scale, the whole thing can be encompassed within about 40 stops or so. So 0 all up to 10, 20, 30, 40 stops. Okay, and as we go from 1 all the way up here, the brightness level increases by double each time we go to a stop. Okay, so by the time we get to 10 stops, it's 1,000 times as bright as when we started off. Okay, so dark moonless night this is what we're trying to simulate here. Of course it can get darker that way, but if we start off at an arbitrary setting, we'll call that 1 stop, increasing by 10 stops, which is 1,000 times as bright, which is probably the equivalent of a full moon night shot. Okay, and we can continue on, double, 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 double. By the time we get to 20 stops, we're 1,000,000 times as bright as what we started off at. And that's probably a dull sort of day or at sunset, sunrise. We can continue on, double, 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 until we get to like 30 stops, which is the equivalent of a sunny day. Now by this time it is 1,000,000,000 times as bright as what we started off at, and that's only 30 stops. We're talking about 1,000,000,000 times as bright. We can continue on just for fun, I suppose, to the surface of the sun. So if you stood on the surface of the sun, it would be that kind of brightness. Okay, 40 stops. And of course we can continue on the range, darker and darker still and brighter still that way. So each stop moving to the right increases, well, it doubles the amount of light, and each stop we move back down that way halves the amount of light, an exponential scale. So we can see that a change of 30 stops is roughly the brightness change of 1 billion times. 1 billion amount of brightness change. And if we stood on the surface of the sun, it's 1 trillion times, 40 stops. Now I had to glean this information from lots of various sources, so some of it might not be totally accurate, but at least it puts across the idea of we've only got a number of stops change, and it makes the equivalent of 1 trillion times as bright. Okay, so an exponential scale. So this is why it's important to get your exposure right, because a couple of stops difference isn't just 2 times as bright, it's 4 times as bright. Okay, so or dark. So it is important to get your exposure right. So a camera sensor needs a certain amount of light falling on it before it will respond at all. At this point, the detail becomes visible in the deep shadow areas. Okay, and as the brightness continues to increase, we get to a stage where the sensor cannot distinguish any further tonal changes. The sensor registers everything above this as pure white, and we say the sensor is saturated. It will be clipped in the histogram. Either in the deep shadows we'll have black clipping, or in the highlights we'll have white clipping. So modern digital SLR cameras have a sensitivity range for a single shot, because of course we can change the ISO and we can change other settings, but for a single shot of around about 8 to 12 stops. And of course it's getting better as we get newer cameras. Indeed, the camera, the Nikon D800, is supposed to have a stop range of about 14 stops. So we'll bring our little diagram back again. This means that for a typical sunny day shot, which could have a brightness range within it of 10 stops or more, the camera may not be able to capture the differences in tonal information at both extremes of the brightness range. Okay, so let's have a look at this typical shot, this typical daytime shot, and we're saying that it's been exposed for this brightness here, which is a typical sunny day shot, but the brightness continues past that particular point to the right here, and it goes darker all the way down to here. So we're covering a brightness range of about 10 stops. There we go, 10 stops for that particular scene. However, let's just imagine that our camera can only capture a brightness range of 8 stops. Okay, that means that anything that's darker than that particular bit there, anything that's darker in that area there, will be registered as pure black. So some of the darker tones in this image can't be distinguished, and they will be registered as pure black. Similarly, at the brighter end, this particular area here, one stop of tonal information from the scene will be registered as pure white, because the sensor is incapable of capturing that dynamic range of tones from the scene. So the camera sensor must receive just the right amount of light in order to, with the correct tonal and color range. So we achieve it by setting the correct ISO, shutter speed and aperture, which we've already covered in previous videos, to balance the naturally available light. Okay, so taking a picture of the puffin here, that looks correctly exposed, which means that it's got a good tonal range and the colours look okay. There's detail in the highlights and a small amount of white clipping maybe, depending on the type of picture that you want. If it's got specular highlights, you know, like the sun, or reflecting bits of the sun off metal and things like that, you will get what's called a specular highlight. It's supposed to be white, and so it will be clipped. Detail in the shadows and a small amount of pure black maybe. Okay, so that is the general principles for a correctly exposed image. If it's overexposed, too much light hitting the sensor, we've got the exposure wrong, then we tend to get washed out colours, burnt out highlights, so we've got pure whites all over the place, and the light tones with no detail. There's no deep greys or blacks because they've all been rendered a kind of grey. Alternatively, we could go to an underexposed image. there's too little light hitting the sensor. So we've got muddy colours, dull tones, blacks, and there's no detail in the dark shadows. And there's no light areas or whites. It all becomes a kind of muddy grey. So a good way of checking whether you've got the right exposure, okay, you can see the thing maybe on the back of your camera if you're into this chimping mode, as they call it. But the best way of doing it is to check the histogram on the camera. And so for the correctly exposed image, we can see we've got a nice histogram with very little clipping on the left, no clipping on the right, and a nice distribution of tones in the histogram, which indicates that we've got a nice correctly exposed image. For this overexposed image, we can see that all the tones are shifted across to the right hand side, and we've got a big peak, a spike on the right hand side, showing that it is totally clipped in the highlight areas. So there's lots and lots of pure white in the image. Alternatively, for the shadow area, the whole tonal range is shifted to the left, and we've got a huge spike on the left hand side, indicating that we've got a load of pure blacks, no tonal information in a lot of the areas, in the darker areas. Okay, so the histogram is a really good way of checking your camera has got the right exposure. Okay, and say these are clipping indications, no detail if it's clipped. So it's worth trying to appreciate what stops are and the fact that it is an exponential scale when we're talking about stops.